Kia ora and welcome everybody to our VUG webinar. So today we're going to have an explore and see how you can use Vernon CMS to tackle each of these topics and to just improve your database overall. So the 4 panels that we ended up having were deaccession, managing your hazards, querying your database, and we also looked at disasters in the database, so what not to do. So we're going to jump straight first into deaccession. And I've got 6 objects open here that have been deaccessioned. And I can tell this by looking at the procedural status. This is often the very last field filled in to say, well, the process is complete. The item has now been fully deaccessioned. But what happens when you need to mark that something is a candidate for deaccession? You might not want it to reflect the procedural status, which is the legal status of your object. It's still technically accession, so flipping that there doesn't really make a lot of sense. So in our Vernon, we have a wonderful window called deaccession and disposal. For this climbing asparagus object, we can see that the deaccession status is deaccessioned, but we could change this to being either candidate or approved or on its way to being deaccessioned. So you can use the status to flag where things are in the process of review when it comes to deaccessioning an item. You can put in the date that it was fully deaccessioned by, why it was deaccessioned, how it was deaccessioned, and where did it go to. So in our case, these were taken to the education department. You can also say when it was given to those individuals or transferred. So date of release for us is the same day as it was deaccessioned. And who decided that this was appropriate? The benefit of this window is it's all about that one object. We know all of this information is about that climbing asparagus. But we've got 6 different objects here. And each of them have the same detail because they were all processed together as a bulk group. So this is where the deaccession activity steps in. And we can see that there's a linked management activity for this object. If we hop into here, we can see a deaccession. This activity is really great for managing large groups of objects. So these natural science specimens were all done at the same time and reviewed as a group. You can see you've just got a lot more information to sort of track that overall process rather than just that little window in object. You can say what status the deaccession process is in. Could be under review, proposed, or in this case, approved. You can say who's proposed it, why, and you can include things like department, who's the staff in charge of this process, and any description about the objects. And you can actually see our 6 items have been attached below. Under the admin tab, you can put in who recommended it, approved it, transferred it. But where this really shines is if I scroll down on the left-hand side, you can add correspondence. So if, for example, you contacted the donors and you wanted to make emails back and forth, and you wanted to add those back into Vernon to show that you did contact the donor, and they declined or accepted the objects back to them. So correspondence is really great for that. Document references, where you can add, maybe a significance checklist or meeting notes and minutes from the board on agreeing or disagreeing with why something should be or shouldn't be deaccessioned. And you can add images. Whereas if you just have object, all of those documents and photos are about the whole object rather than the deaccession process itself. So having it all contained as a related activity gives you a lot more space to talk about the process as a whole. So that's just a really quick overview of how Vernon handles deaccessioning. I thought I'd touch on a few things that our panelists brought up on the day. One of the things you might notice is that these objects are still located as Botany Shelf 1 in our storeroom, even after they've been transferred to the education department. So what's really common is people create a new location called deaccessioned to mark any items that have left their care. So you don't have to worry about updating the location. So if we go to object location, we can move those to a new deaccession location or make a deaccession location. So if we go move, and I'll put in Paul as the authorizer. I'll blame him for everything. We can choose the reason that this is being done as it's being deaccessioned. And if I go to this drop-down list, you'll notice that there is actually no term for deaccessioned, but I can create a new one. I always like making mine capitalized because it stands out, but you don't have to do that. And that can now be its new location. You can also update its usual location as well. So I can close that. And now if we go back to our main screen, you can see that current location is now reflected as deaccessioned. It's no longer needing to have its location tracked. So that's something that Dean mentioned from Queensland Museum that they do. And I think it's a really great way of pulling out those items from being included in your locations when you're searching for current objects. They're no longer there anyway. So now that these items are deaccessioned and I've updated the location, I've got all of the right information attached to it, I don't really want people to continue to edit this record. I want it to be protected. That way, because we no longer have it, we don't really have any way to fact check things that happen to it. If people added more information, we don't know if that's true or not because we don't have the object anymore. So we're going to use something called procedural control. You can get into procedural control by going to the database, down to other files. Under here, I like to type in status and then hit enter on your keyboard. So this is going to open up all of the different procedural statuses that Vernon has available. We're going to look at object procedural status. It's going to open up a new record for us. And I want to make it when something gets that final deaccession status that it becomes protected. So because this is blank, I have to use the search bar at the top to open it up. You can either type in deaccessioned in full or the shorthand for it is DEA. In our deaccessioned, you can have a whole range of options. But the one that we're concerned about today is to protect records when they reach this status. So if I choose that one and save the record and close. And if I flip to the next one in the list, you'll see a little message comes up with records with status deaccession are protected. No changes will be saved. But each time you browse through it, it comes up with a little warning that they're protected and no changes will be saved. So again, a good tip is to make sure you've updated all the information that you want about that object before you make it deaccessioned. And if you're worried that you need to edit something and you can't do it, it's still useful to have that ticked because it's only supervisors who are going to know how to get into the status and be able to edit it. So if you need to edit something on those windows, you just go back in, open up the procedural status, find the deaccessioned record, and unticking it will mean that you can edit them again. This does mean that everybody can edit deaccessioned records for however long that is unticked. There's also a range of rules and actions that you can do or automated reports that happen when you are changing something to that status. So for example, it might be before it can be deaccessioned, they have to fill in this window. You have to have all of these different fields filled in. You could assign a task that they have to label the object or an action that it emails out to the conservator, or there's tasks to do. You can also generate a report that gets printed out and added to a folder if you need. So if you're interested in any of those, just give us an email and we'll be happy to help you set them up. Often what people do is they just pop in a little message here to remind people about certain protocols they have to do outside of Vernon. So once they've made it deaccessioned in the Vernon record, maybe they have to go and update the original register. So a message can sometimes be really useful here as well. There's also some deaccession rules that can be set up for security so that only supervisor groups or specific users are able to make a record deaccessioned. So if you are interested, contact us about that and we can help you set up your security so that only certain people can make a record deaccessioned. So now we have these lovely 6 objects all deaccessioned and protected, but it's not very useful if some of our users find these records consistently. If someone's planning an exhibition and they're searching through your collection, it's not very helpful to have them keep coming up with deaccession records all the time. Others might be the public or a front of house who's using Vernon to answer queries. Again, these are no longer part of your collection, so having them show up in your search can sometimes be more of a hindrance than a help. You can, under advanced search, have something called a results filter. So for example, there's accessioned, which will bring back only things that are accessioned, or deaccessioned, which will bring back only things that are deaccessioned. You can create your own filter and you can enforce it for different security groups. So for example, you might want to have all objects show up as long as they're not deaccessioned. So that would include loans as well as accessioned items. So we can create one of those and we can enforce it for like the public view. So they can't choose this anymore. They only get to see loaned or accessioned items. To do this, we go to Tools, System Maintenance, Search Tool, Search Filters. At the top here, we can decide on our new status. So it's object status. We could call it active collections. And we could say, as long as it's not equal to deaccessioned, let's actually choose some from the list. Yeah, as long as it's not deaccessioned or a considered item or an accessory. So it now means that if any of our records are one of those, they won't show up. We could say, well, we don't want this. We want this enforced for the public security group for object. And the default view we want is active collections. And I also want that to be enforced. So that means they can't turn it off. They can never find or search for deaccession or considered items. By default, the advanced search will filter it. You can also set it for specific users if you don't want to do it for groups, but we prefer setting things up for groups overall. So if I click OK, and if I logged out and went to the public one, that filter would just be permanently set to active collections for them, and it would be grayed out and they wouldn't be able to tick it. So that was a whirlwind tour of the deaccessioned options. We're going to pivot a little bit and look at hazards. So to look at hazards, we're actually going to pull up a series of model trains that we have. All of these are from On Loan, but these are hiding something slightly sinister. Underneath the administration and risk assessment window, we have a new table that we've created. So we've always had the risk table, but in our recent version, we have changed it to splitting it into 2. So risk to object deals with things like theft, or it might be in a high fire risk, or it might be very vulnerable to water damage. Hazard and object, though, is where the object itself is dangerous or hazardous to collection staff or to other objects. In our case, this very innocent little model train actually has lead paint. And we can say what part of the object has this, and we can determine what level of risk it is. And there's the hazard details, which pulls from the type of hazard. You can put in an assessment date and who decided this. And if I open up that lead paint, you get another more detailed view. You can put in a classification. And here I've just put in our generic classification, but you might have classes specific to legislation, like class 1, class 2, what type of material it is, what's the summary of this hazard, what impact it might have, and if you have any specific policies and procedures around dealing with this kind of hazard. You can also put in authorized locations for it or prohibited. So if you have radiation storage, you might have a specific location and then the rest of the site might be prohibited. You might have a specific person who has to be called if there's an issue with this kind of hazard. And you can put in an expiry date for the hazard and how frequently it needs to be reviewed. So that's all per object again, but sometimes you might end up dealing with batches of objects or an incident. So we've also created, and I'll just minimize that one. We've also created a risk management activity. So if I open this up, I made one today in preparation for this webinar. So it doesn't actually match any of the objects because our demo system is full of very safe things. But I made an incident where theoretically we found a bunch of broken mercury thermometers. So I've set the procedural status as an incident. You can make whatever procedural statuses you like here. It could be that it's part of a review. It could be an incident. It could be a pest check. It could be a range of different things. I've made a reason that this was discovered in the collection. I've set the priority as relatively high and a date that the incident started and the date it ended. And you can see here it's the same table that we have in the object, but this time the hazard is mercury and the location that it was found in, who found it, or action, who took action. In our case, Paul was changing his hats and becoming the conservator, and he discovered the broken thermometers. You can put descriptions about what happened and what was the outcome. And under the recommendations tab, you can put in a lot of detail about recommended storage, recommended handling and transport, and recommended display. So that was the very quick whirlwind tour of what we have on offer for risk management. Jessica Aiken at the Police Museum has actually gone through and added an image that shows up as the very first image that is flagging it as a hazard. So you don't end up having to look at the hazardous work, or it grabs your attention very boldly as soon as you open the record that there's just a giant image that says hazard. But you can also update what we call the one-line display, which is the summary at the top here. So you might have noticed when I opened up my botany record, there's this little infinity symbol that appears in the one-line display for these objects and in lists. That indicates to me that this object is deaccessioned. So you can actually come up with your own beginning name for things. If I go into the administration and risk assessment window, you can set up a rule that if there's a hazard listed, it will show up in here. Personally, I like the idea of having it being linked to the restriction type, because sometimes a hazard may exist in the object, but it's at such low levels that it's almost safe, if that makes sense. So it may not be worth flagging the hazard up in the top because it has an entry in this table. So it might be useful to say that there's a restriction on this record. So we actually have created one. There's a culturally sensitive one, which has a short name of this little diamond shape. And I've also got hazardous, where I've decided the short name would be hazmat in all caps. And we can create a one-line display rule that if this has hazardous in the restriction type, it will change to showing hazmat up in the one-line display. So you know immediately that this is hazardous, and it will show up in List Manager and all over the place. So if we wanted to do this, the first thing we have to do is set up the rule that lets us show the short name, which is this little field, for the restriction type. And we're going to use user symbolics for this. So if we go to Tools, System Maintenance, User Defined Parameter, User Symbolics. So there's already an example here called restrictions. But under simple symbolic, we said, right, the information we're looking for is in restriction type, which is called restriction. I want to find that short name, and it's related to that restriction field again. So you just type in those two, and it will show the short name. Now that we've got that saved, now that we've got that saved, we can edit what our one-line display shows us. So you can edit what fields are included here at any time. By default, I think it's accession number, name and title, and artist, and potentially something else like classification. But you can edit what's useful for you guys to see at the top by going to System Maintenance, Tools, System Maintenance, User Defined Parameters, User View Configuration. So it's going to open a brand new user view configuration, but we're going to search for the one-line display. So if you put in 1 and hit enter, you get a chance to choose one-line display for object. As you can see from this giant list, you can edit this for any activity or other file in Vernon. So one-line display for object. This opens up. And you can see here, I'll delete that row, that we've got deaccession flag, accession number, name and title, and primary maker. You can use the arrow key on your keyboard to add a new line. Or in my case, I want to add it before accession number, but after a deaccession flag. I can hit insert on my keyboard. And if I can remember it, I can type the name of my symbolic, but if not, you can go to the options button. And the symbolics are always at the bottom. There they are, restrictions. So that's now been added to my one-line display. I can close and save. And so anytime that I add that restriction to a record, it's going to show up in the one-line display. So if I added culturally sensitive, it's now showing that diamond. So the last thing for hazards is something that Jess mentioned again, with being able to hide a record if it has a restriction on it. So in their case, they have records where they've deemed them hazardous and they want to hide them from the public or from other users, and only certain security groups can actually see those records. So this one's a little bit more complex, but so don't worry about memorizing the code by any means, but it's good to know that it's something you can do. And again, it's something that we can quickly email you and you can copy and paste it directly in. But you can go to Tools, System Maintenance, and up to Security Tool. We want to open data file. By default, you can either use the search bar to search for the particular file that you're wanting to lock down, but I find if you click into the notes field, object autofills. It's a nice little quick hack. You might see in some of these, and it's a bit small. So what I'll do is I'll copy it and paste it in here. So inside of the public group, they don't have the right to create, so no rights to create, no rights to delete, and they can't modify a record. And their ability to see something, to view, is this lovely little piece of code, which just basically says it depends on the restriction field, and then it has the system IDs of the types of restrictions. So number one is if it's hazardous, and the other one is CUL, which stands for culturally sensitive. So if it's either of these two, don't show it. So don't worry too much about having to retype this, but it's just nice to know that you can list as many as you like in here. And it would say if that restriction's been highlighted, they will be unable to view it. Something similar exists for the object status. So in this case, the social catalogers are unable to view or modify deaccessioned or considered objects. So with their procedural status being deaccessioned or considered. So we're again more than happy to help you set these up. Or if you feel confident with it, there is a help article which goes through how you can write your own SE ob depends. So that lets you sort of hide away those records so that the public who might be using it, like your front of house staff or catalogers or people who maybe shouldn't have to see something that's culturally sensitive, like human remains or things like that. Next, we're going to talk about querying the database. And this one is perhaps less of advice on ways that you can use Vernon, and maybe more of an exploration of the different types of relationships you can put into Vernon. So I think the thing that struck me was something that David said, of that objects themselves aren't necessarily queer. The queering comes from events, people, and places. It's that context-rich cataloging. So I think Vernon's quite good at creating a web of connections between objects to other things. And I thought I'd highlight today a little bit about the person, event, and topic file. So 2 of those things are in the cataloging module, so they're available for everybody. The topic file is specific to just activities. So let's start with person. So with person, you can record gender, and it doesn't have to be binary male or female. It is an open authority file, so you can create as many terms as you like just by going create new authority, and you can create as many terms as you like. So it could be gender fluid. So you can create as many different types of genders as you like. We are investigating in our next version that will be coming out ways of adding a sexuality field, adding pronoun field, and also looking at how we perhaps make gender multi-valued. Unfortunately, that means that if you need it right now, you don't have it. And also if you're on an older version where you're not able to upgrade, you still don't have it as well. So ways around that. You can create a user-defined field. So there's a window under person called user-defined field. And at the moment, they're just empty blank fields. But you could create a sexuality field here, and under text fields, you could create a pronoun field. So let's do that. If we go to the tools menu, down to system maintenance, user-defined parameters, user-defined fields configuration. Gosh, there are lots of tongue twisters. So you'll see the file says person. The very first window we have here is all of our authority files. So under file display name, we might write sexuality. And the authority file name we might call also sexuality. Under the text one, we might say that we want to have pronouns. If we save this, we can then open up that user-defined fields window, and you can see here that we have our authority fields for sexuality, and we have our text field for pronouns. I thought another point that I'd make here is that in the active nationality tab, there is a space for community and community details. It is in the ethnicity table, but it doesn't have to be linked to ethnicity. It's the same as language. It's just a space to record if people belong to a specific community. Another one is the category. So you can create categories of types of people in any way that you want. There's also the active dates if they were particularly active in a place, which might be useful if they were part of, for example, with Erica's one of the commune. I think it was referred to as the fairies. Could be wrong. But they were active in that community in the 70s for a set period of time, founding the first space that was free for people who were homosexual to be. So that might be a really great place to record those details. We've also got a biography display where you can write a full biography of people, and that is searchable through alt text as well. I thought we'd quickly head back into object. And there was a moment in Erica's talk where she mentioned how they invited members of the queer community to come in and apply a lens on their collection and look at objects and say how they perceived them with a queer lens. And I thought how wonderful to have that as a researcher's comment or remark with the name of the person and the date. And this is something that if we've recorded it in Vernon, perhaps under the attribution comments and remarks, you could put that in here and have a type that it's to be sent online. And so you can say anything that has that comment could go online onto the browser. And that's much wider than just necessarily a queer lens. It's a great space to invite knowledge holders to share their view on your collection on a specific object. One of my other favorites, and this is something that's available to all Vernon users, is the event file. So I actually made a dummy one today of the Auckland Pride Parade. So this is an example of a type of event, a description of the event, when did it happen and what time, and what was some consequences of that event, why was it so important. There's associations, so you can put in place who was the organizers, if there was any significant people that attended. Are there any objects that you have that are related to that event and time? Event just gives you a lot of space to record details and stories and connections that perhaps an object doesn't have by itself. It's part of a larger story. An event is a place to share that larger vision. Topic. So I was thinking how wonderful this would be as a space for like those essays that Erica compiled about what does it mean to be queer and Indigenous, or what does it mean for women's rights, or different topics that you could have in this place, and you can put in the summary and abstract description, and all of that can be formatted so it appears almost like a blog post on our website. You can again add in those links, that web of connection, the thing that gives you context. Who were the people that were subject or associated with this topic? Was there any specific categories this covers? Is there places and dates and events and periods? It does take a lot more time to catalog to this level, but it does bring those stories and that knowledge that often exists in people's minds, or all of the work that people do for exhibitions. In the case of Auckland Museum's audio guide, perhaps bringing some of those topics into topic would mean that that is not just a one and done, it exists in the database. It's something people can go back and reference, and they have all of those objects connected together with links to those important events and places. I like to think of topic as sort of the hub of the storytelling for Vernon. So, disasters in the database, we had a couple of things come up that I thought were really crucial. One was backups. Backups. Make sure you have backups. And we've learned lessons from disasters that have happened through different sites of, do you know where your backups are if there was an emergency? Can you get to them quickly? How long is your oldest backup? So make sure your IT isn't just backing up every day and having it be overwritten every day. You want to have probably at least 3 years of backups. It might be that you're happy to live with longer, but if you think if they're backing up every day or even every month or even every 6 months, is it reliable that you're going to catch whatever problems might exist that's corrupted something? Or so you want to make sure that you know where your backups are, that they're regular, but also that there's some long-term ones. If you have any questions about your backups, please feel free to email us. We're more than happy to work through it. We'd rather have it at before something happens rather than try and help you afterwards where something's gone wrong. So we're really happy to be helping you to set in measures. Some sites have got agreements that they have with their IT, so that even if staff change, there's an agreement that whoever's brought on, that they're like onboarded as to where everything's going to be located. A disaster sort of management for if your system goes down. So bringing your IT on side is a critical step. Sometimes I personally find it very useful to remind them about the value of Vernon. One is, how long have you had Vernon for? How much you pay for Vernon every year? If you think about the expense of your collection, this is essentially a digital copy of that collection. So it is valued at a similar rate, because without all that knowledge, we've had sites that lost all of their databases before, and the objects lose a lot of meaning because they suddenly don't know if it's got paint on it and it's just a wooden artifact and you don't know where it came from, who gave it to you, what region it's from. It becomes devoid of any meaning. So a lot of your digital database actually gives your value to your object collection as well. And then you start thinking about the amount of staff time you've put in, of just staff hours and the money that costs. So sometimes coming at it from a monetary aspect can lend you real credence in arguing for, I need to know where these backups are. I need to know how we do it, and it needs to be done effectively. And it needs to be communicated regularly to the registry team. So that's probably my favorite thing, is to scare people with that one. But in terms of other things that came up in the disasters in the database discussion, A lot of it was covered in our most recent webinar on system maintenance. So if you haven't already, please watch that webinar. It's on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it to your heart's content. Send it to everybody that you think might need to watch it. It might be useful for some of the IT. Okay, so 2 things that came up in that session was sometimes when you look back in history, it's not always the kindest previous staff or current staff. You're often picking up mistakes that the same people made over and over again. It might have been an XML import gone wrong. It could have been a bad habit. But often there's the case where there's a staff member's name that you all know, and you know when you open a record, you see that they've edited it, that you are to be wary of certain things. So sometimes you might want to clean that up. You can use the update history search to look at what a specific user has done. So if I search on object, right down the very bottom is an option called update history. You can put in a username. So it can be current users, but if they are no longer a current user, you can still type in their username. So if I put in collect, you can put in a date and a time if you want a specific time range. So if you know that a mistake happened with an XML import, you could probably put in the date and time of that import. Or if you leave it blank like I will, it'll just show everything that person has ever edited. You can choose created only, which will just bring back records that they made, not ones that they edited. But if I click OK, and next, it shows me, well, out of the demo system, I've edited 275 records or created them. If I go into object and let's say open up a record, you can see who's edited a object record at any time. Under the administration risks window, there's this updated by window that shows you the history of all of the times that it's been changed. So it's more reliable than the cataloger field because that relies on them adding it themselves. But every time they make a change, it will record whoever has their username and the date that they changed it. So it's very useful if there's the same person making the same problems over and over again. Another good reason to let people be individually users in Vernon. Last but not least, we talked about phantom numbers that exist inside of Vernon. And this happens because someone has deleted an authority term incorrectly. So if I clicked on furniture and went to go to, I can delete this term by going File, Delete. I decide not to check that it's in use, and I just decide to delete that entry. When I go back to this record, you see the number 16. So this isn't the case where Vernon's got confused. It's trying to remember what had been stored there before. So instead of having any actual record there, it's having that link preserved as a system ID. So you might occasionally look through your system and find a whole bunch of these phantom numbers. You can get rid of these. To do that, you can go to Tools, Authority Tool, Authority Term Report Replace. In my case, my phantom number is showing up in the object type field. So that's my authority file. So here is where we want to type in 16. It's going to say it's unable to find it, but that's okay. What we want to do is click on Cancel. It'll then tell you that it can't find it, but you can just click on it OK, and it will still do a report on all the places that it has found the number 16. We can then do a replace where I want to replace it with nothing. So I just want that to disappear. So I'm going to click replace, and that's going to find it in 15 records. It's then going to go through and find all those places that it exists. And I can click yes to going ahead and performing the replacement, effectively removing it from all of the places in the system that it is. And I can see that it's finished by, at the very bottom, it says finished. Woohoo! So that's it for the VUG webinar. Thank you again to all of our wonderful panelists and everyone who came along to the VUG. If you feel like you've missed out, you can watch the VUG playlist, or if you want to see more webinars, you can watch our webinar playlist by clicking the links on the video. Don't forget to subscribe and choose to get notified so you never miss another webinar. Until the next one, mate wa, see you later.